Welcome to Ladies Talking Love, Season 3, Episode 10, Creating a Partnership Marriage. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. I just want to let you know that you are in for a super big treat today listening to this episode. I got to have Tim and Aubrey Chaves on to talk about partnership marriage. And this is a topic that I'm so passionate about because it's something that's been really hard for me in my marriage. And a lot of what has made it hard to create a partnership marriage has come from me self-silencing and not really being able to speak up for myself, not having a self, not knowing how to find things that I was passionate about, and just kind of falling into these roles that I felt like society and my faith tradition wanted me to be in instead of creating what motherhood and what being a wife looked like for me. And so today, talking with Tim and Aubrey, they just give such a beautiful explanation about their journey of creating a partnership marriage and helping especially Aubrey really come into finding herself and bringing her full self into the partnership. Because I think that's something that a lot of us as women struggle with is we've been raised to serve and look outward, which are all beautiful things. But when it gets to the extreme, so much so that we lose ourselves, we're actually limiting the joy and connection we can have in our relationships because we're not showing up authentically, because we've silenced our desires and our needs and the things that we think to preserve the relationship, which actually makes it so that we can't have a close relationship because we're not showing up authentically. Tim and Aubrey Chaves grew up near Salt Lake City, Utah. They both went to middle school and high school together. Tim served an LDS mission to Montevideo, Uruguay. He attended BYU for his undergraduate studies before earning an MBA from Harvard Business School and is now an entrepreneur working in Utah County. Aubrey received a degree in elementary education from Utah State before teaching 4th grade. She now owns a cake decorating business. Tim and Aubrey are the parents of 4 children and are hosts of the Faith Matters podcast. Before jumping in, I just want to let you know about a resource that I created for you. I have struggled so much throughout my motherhood in finding myself. It took me years of struggle, and I didn't enjoy motherhood as much as I could have because I had completely lost myself in being the type of mother I felt like I should be, instead of finding my own path in motherhood and what worked for me and for us as a couple. And over the past 8 years of being a mom, I feel like I finally found a sweet spot where I found myself. I found things that light me up, but I've also been able to find so much more joy in motherhood through the process of coming into myself and bringing my full authentic self. And so I created a guide with 5 of the steps that I took to help bring my full authentic self into my marriage, but also into motherhood. And it has completely changed the joy that I feel and the authenticity I feel in my relationships and the ability that I have now to really enjoy motherhood in a way I hadn't before. And it's been a gift not only to me, but also to my family. And just in case you're not sold yet, I also have links to my very favorite sex products and resources, my favorite parenting items, and just household things that I can't live without. And it's all included in the free download. So pause the episode, click on the link, and get your free download right to your inbox. But without further ado, let's talk love. I'm super excited to welcome Tim and Aubrey Chaves onto Ladies Talking Love today. Thanks so much for joining me, guys.
Sure. Thank you.
Of course. It's our pleasure.
I'd love to have you just start by introducing yourself. It's not very often we get a couple on, which is super fun, especially with our topic today. So I'd just love for our listeners to hear a little bit about your backgrounds.
Sure. Yeah. Tim and I both grew up in Sandy, Utah, and sort of together, we went to middle school together and met on the first day of seventh grade. And we're good friends, but especially in high school, just we're the best of friends. And then I went to Utah State for elementary education and taught fourth grade for a couple of years. And then Tim and I got married in 2006. So we've been married almost 17 years. We have 4 kids. So our oldest is 14, down to 5. And I stay home with them. And Tim and I also are on the executive board for the Faith Matters Foundation, and we host the podcast there. So it's been a really fun project that we've been doing together for a few years now.
It's a great podcast. I'll link it for sure in the show notes.
Thank you. Yeah, on my end, since we met so early in 7th grade, basically our paths have pretty much aligned. The only difference is I went to BYU for undergrad. My career has been primarily in technology. So a few years after graduating BYU, I also did an MBA out at Harvard Business School. So we lived in Boston for a couple of years. And after that, started a small software company here in Utah and sold that in 2019. And since that time, like Aubrey mentioned, most of my time has been dedicated to family stuff as well as faith matters. Although I am now dabbling in AI, given the recent advances, and I'm simultaneously excited and terrified about what's happening there.
I know my husband.
Yeah,
my husband keeps saying, he's like, our kids might never drive. Like they're just gonna have self-driving cars.
Seriously.
Oh, there's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
It is. Lots of changes. Thank you. Well, I'm so excited to talk today about partnership marriage. I heard Aubrey and Tim actually on another podcast they help host. And when I heard them talking about a new book about partnership marriage, I was like, Tim and Aubrey have their own story about transitioning to a more partnership marriage. And I know for myself, and I think a lot of us who grew up in religious backgrounds or conservative backgrounds, there's a lot of patterns that we can bring into marriage that might not be serving us very well. And especially for, I think, women. Anyway, I heard that and I was like, I have to get them on to hear more of their story. So to start off, I would just love to hear, when you first got married, what were some of the patterns that maybe you brought into marriage that were traditional from your families or your religious background?
I think it was largely unexamined, first of all. So I think a lot of this was really unconscious. And maybe the first thing that sort of became problematic is that I really had this assumption that my role was to be a caretaker. And I think that I absorbed that at church and at home, this idea that a helpmeet meant that my job was sort of to anticipate needs. I was like pretty good at that. I think I'm naturally pretty maternal, and I was a teacher, and that's how I approached being a spouse. And then slowly, I think what that sort of became is that it was sort of an erasure of self. I got so good at anticipating what other people wanted, and especially Tim. Like I was so hyper aware of how he was feeling and what he wanted that it started becoming really difficult to even get connection to my own wants and needs. And I think maybe the specific problem in that pattern was this idea that maybe I shouldn't have wants and needs. The ideal is a selfless wife and mother. I would say that's number one. But I also had parents who were very affectionate and like genuinely in love my whole childhood. And so I feel like that was a real gift because even though I came with that problem, I also really felt like I had the tools to work through it. It was something that I got to watch them navigate also every day. And so when finally like I was in this situation of a marriage, I could start working on it with myself, but I didn't even know it was a problem until it was a problem.
From my end, I can't really disconnect the patterns that I brought into it from religious background and worldview and struggles that I had with mental health. The religious background and worldview, meaning if you look back over the history of the church that we belong to, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, both the church itself and sort of like its scriptural history, there is a very strong patriarchy in a lot of that, and it's very difficult to escape. In my own family background, my parents actually, I think, did have a quite equal marriage, so I didn't absorb inequality from them. But if anything, well, then I have to bring in the mental health aspect because I have OCD, which in my younger life manifested itself primarily as scrupulosity, which means sort of an obsession with keeping the rules and making sure that you're 100% right and correct in all of your behavior and thoughts and actions at all times. And so even though my parents, I don't think displayed for me inequality, I had sort of, because of my natural tendencies towards scrupulosity, I had this sort of fundamentalist worldview that made me look at the scriptures and, the Bible or Latter-day Saint scripture, or look at past words from church leaders over the past 200 years during which those decades there was an explicit and strong patriarchy, and sort of seeing that in this literalist, fundamentalist worldview and unable to totally escape from that. I think that what I brought into it was this sort of modernized version of that, which is like partnership of equals, but sort of wink, wink, not really. At the end of the day, the man
I
actually
did the same.
is in charge. Yeah. And
not in a mean way, but it's just
not
tradition.
At all.
It's
no,
just
it's sort of like this benevolent patriarchy, I think, is the way a lot of people have sort of lived it out in the past few decades in Mormonism, where it is absolutely incumbent upon the man to be kind, to be loving, to be generous. But at the end of the day, they also, the word that we use is preside, meaning they're sort of the president, and the wife. So it's like president and co-president is almost like maybe a way that a lot of people see it. So not vice president, but like at the same time, one doesn't have the co. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's sort of how I took it. And so it's like little rituals, like who's going to ask someone to say a prayer, say a blessing over the food? That falls upon the man. Who's going to like get the family together for another, this is another ritual in Mormonism, family home meeting, which is this Monday night gathering where we're going to get together and talk about scriptures or have some kind of lesson or whatever. Who's going to like make that all happen? That's the man. And so I came into the marriage, I think, sort of expecting that to be the way we did it because it was quote unquote right. It was the righteous thing to do. It was a scriptural pattern. And I do not want this to sound like I'm blaming Aubrey in any way for anything that I did wrong. And there have been so many things. But I think with my worldview being that way, Aubrey, I think, kind of was on board with that. And so we unconsciously stepped into that pattern. Am I getting that right? Do you think, Aubrey?
Oh, totally. But Ariel, I was just going to add, I know there are more extreme versions of this. If anyone had seen our marriage from the outside, I don't think this is anything you could have noticed. It looked very equal. It was more just, it was this combination of Tim's perfectionism and my explicit understanding that he was supposed to be presiding. And so because his family really did not operate this way, I think he sort of ended up playing this role because I was playing the opposite
to him
role.
to
like
play
it was,
yeah.
Yes, this is a dance and I was leading that dance in so many ways. I think for what we kind of had discovered over the years is that in a lot of ways, Tim was completely unaware of the role he was even being put in because it just wasn't even on his radar. He was not even a part of that story. It was so much my story because it was, on my side, a lot of it really was intentional. Like I was looking to him to ask someone to say the prayer and like waiting, you know, you're going to do that. Not because he thinks he's going to put me in my place at all. It was just, those were my expectations. And I made that the dynamic of our family in a lot of ways. Looking back, I feel like I was driving that dynamic because it was comfortable for me.
Yeah.
It felt the most comfortable. I think also it's hard, especially when kids start coming. It's like being a mom and a wife is the way to excel. It felt like I had set aside other passions and ideas, other ways that my future could have gone. And so it felt like all of my talents needed to be poured into being a mom and a wife. In a lot of ways, I think that gave me a lot of joy, but I think it also probably kind of fueled this weird patriarchy thing that we are grappling with as a community in our church.
And I totally relate what you were saying. I remember looking to my husband, Kyle, and being like, are you going to ask
like, step up?
I am waiting for you and feeling so resentful.
Yeah.
Like, come on.
Yes.
And just coming into it and just expecting like, this is my role. So this is yours. Why aren't you doing it? You know?
Yes.
So you kind of talked about, Aubrey, that it was fine and just kind of this tradition until it reached this breaking point. What was that for you?
Well, I do remember one specific moment, but I'm sure this is something, it was years of it becoming a problem. But when Tim went to grad school in Boston, I do remember being out with friends, and I don't remember the activities we were doing, but we were going to get dinner and we were doing something else. And I remember half the group was like, we are starving and let's go eat dinner first and then we'll go do this other thing. And I remember feeling like, oh my gosh, yeah, I am starving. I am so hungry. Let's go eat right now. And then the plans changed. And for some reason, we all decided to flip flop and we're going to eat after. And I remember the sensation of hunger completely disappearing. And it was super disturbing to me. I realized I actually genuinely couldn't tell if I was hungry. I was so disconnected from my body and from my mind, just sitting by myself asking, like, do I feel hungry? I couldn't even tell anymore. And so I think that's when I realized something is broken here. I knew that feeling of genuinely not having an opinion, feeling like I don't have a preference. But it kind of scared me when I realized even when I'm reaching for it, there's just nothing there. I just felt numb. I would say like that was the big breaking point. And so I made an appointment with a therapist and just told her that like something's wrong. I don't know what I like or what I want. Even when I'm trying, I feel like a blank slate.
After that moment of noticing the hunger, did you start to notice that in other areas of your life then too? Okay.
Yes. Everywhere. I am nothing. I am a blank slate. And I just remember saying that to her on the very first day. I'm blank. I can't describe myself. And if you ask me what I want, I feel just totally numb. And I just remember her saying like, no, you're not a blank slate. That's not a thing. It's there. You're just so good at overriding that feeling that it's hard for you to find anymore. And so that was kind of the beginning of recognizing that having a self was actually going to be better for all of my relationships, because I think I had gotten to that point in an effort to have a good marriage. And so it kind of stopped me in my tracks and realized that this was the thing that was breaking my relationship, because you can't have any intimacy if there's no honesty there. That's what it was. It felt like kind of a shell of a person, or in a lot of cases, a mirror. I just felt like I needed to get to that point to decide that it was worth trying to have a self and doing things that I would have for a lot of years called selfish, so that I could figure out who I was and be a person that could be in relationship with other people in my life. And so it started very slowly, kind of like an experiment, just having an opinions and trying to make decisions. And the fruits were so good. It became so clear that this was a much better way to be in relationships.
And I'm so glad you brought up that point, that you were almost, in the way you were trying to make your relationships better, you were actually kind of stifling them and limiting them.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. I was reading some research about what's called self-silencing in women, and a lot of women will self-silence their own thoughts or desires or things that they think because they want to protect their relationship. But in reality, like you said, they're actually making it impossible to have deeper connections by not sharing themselves. But we think, if I stifle this, if I just go along, I'm going to protect and have a deeper relationship. But it's completely the opposite.
Yes, it 100% doesn't work, especially in conflict. It's one thing when you're trying to decide where you're going to eat, but it's so much harder when there's conflict. And so my line of reasoning was, don't say the thing that's bothering you, because then you just create more negative energy in the house. You just go deal with it by yourself, and then you can have peace, And I wish that you could actually see visually the energy in the house when it's unspoken. It's so much worse, but that's still a lesson that I'm learning. It's hard to just say the thing that is painful, even if there's no solution. I mean, this is still something I feel like I'm totally in the middle of, but what I'm learning over and over is that being so vulnerable, like speaking what is hurtful, that actually creates connection. So ironically, the thing that I was so afraid of, not speaking, is disconnecting.
Yeah.
And saying what hurts in a really honest way, even if there's no solution, even if you still disagree, or that act of speaking the pain is connecting. And I wish someone had told me that's how you do it.
Right. I remember going to therapy and just having this realization that I was kind of trying to control Kyle. And I remember telling him this, and he just showed this amazing amount of love for me. And I was like, why do you love me? I've been trying to control you. Like, this isn't good. But just opening up and sharing and then working on it was so vulnerable. What did you notice during this time? Had you noticed that Aubrey wasn't having a self as much, Tim?
It took a very long time. I wish I could say that was my diagnosis from day one. And it was like so not on my radar. I wasn't able to empathize sufficiently, I think, to understand that that's what she was feeling. I had like caveman words basically for what was going on. I remember several times early in our marriage where I felt like Aubrey said, going to dinner is one thing. And I remember feeling like in those situations, I really do want to know where Aubrey wants to go, but it seems like she doesn't really care. And so,
because she keeps saying, I don't care.
Yes. Yeah. But like in conflict, it really is so much harder. And I remember several times feeling like we were having a discussion where we disagreed in some way. And that happened very rarely, very, very rarely, actually, obviously, for maybe obvious reasons. And we've never been the type of couple that like raises our voices at each other or anything like that. And I felt like in many of those instances, I remember actually one very specifically where we were talking about sprinklers. I think like is either where a pipe was going to go, or like maybe it was the pipe we're in, it was about like watering patterns or something. And I like had an opinion. Do you remember this one, Aubrey? Oh my gosh. Okay. We were kind of going back and forth, and I was like, well, I really think because of this, and maybe I was a little bit more emotional in the way that I said it, that I'm expressing it here. And I remember Aubrey stopped talking completely. And I don't know if she said okay or whatever, but like the discussion was over, and I guess we were going to do it my way. From my perspective, again, my caveman word for this was for the next 2 to 3 days, I felt like I was getting the silent treatment. Like she said, the energy in the house was completely different. You could sense it as soon as you walked in. Like something's really, really wrong. And I did not understand what had happened at all there, which was Aubrey has silenced herself, and we're just going with my thing because she feels like, for whatever reason, my opinion rules the day. And she's continuing to silence herself, even though she's feeling all of these things. And that's, I think, really contributing to the energy that we're feeling in this house. My interpretation was so naive, but it was like, okay, I said something that just tripped her in some way, and she is so mad at me that she's refusing to talk to me. So it was like a total misinterpretation of what was going on. And only once Aubrey took that step, I think, of really figuring it out, did she start to explain to me what was going on. And it was like a total light bulb for me. To your question, I wish I had been much more aware, much earlier, and much more empathetic, but I wasn't capable of it at that time.
But no fault of your own. I feel like we expect our partner to read our minds, and that never works.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a really good example of the patriarchy issue coming to a head, because what I would experience anytime there was not just conflict, but like disagreement. So the sprinkler example is really good. But I think when we were having those conversations, as soon as Tim disagreed, truly, I felt like the conversation was over. The way I was hearing it was, I'm being corrected. Like, here's the right way. And it was the end of the conversation. That's really how it went for a long time. And of course, Tim couldn't know that, because that was not how it was for him growing up. And I remember so vividly sitting in the car one time with him, and we kind of realized that this was happening. And I remember him saying, like, I always expected if you disagreed, you would just keep talking. He never expected the conversation to be over. It was for me. It felt like he had the last word, because I was like, okay, I guess that's how we're doing it. And he was 100% expecting a back and forth. And so in a lot of ways, it was the easiest fix, because just knowing that that was his expectation was an invitation to just experiment with that. And so in situations where there's not a lot of energy, there's just like a casual disagreement, it was so easy to be like, oh my gosh, he literally did expect me to be like, no, that's the bad place to put the sprinkler. I think we should do it over here. He didn't have any feelings. There were no emotions about that. And it was so heavy for me and so hard to push back on anything. And so this dynamic was just the deepest groove in our relationship, because we just did that over and over and over. And so in a lot of ways, it was disconnecting, because Tim would never know what I was actually thinking. He started the conversation and I ended it always. And then I would expect to like be able to take care of my own feelings. I don't know why I feel angry and resentful about this, but like, I'm going to figure it out by myself. And in a relationship, it requires communication. And so that was the cycle that was so hard, because that comes up so naturally all the time. And that was always the role I played in those disagreements.
Would you say that with the patriarchal pattern that you had grown up with or seen or believed in, that it was also linked to your righteousness, like by me kind of suppressing this and letting my head of household or whatever decide?
I don't know if I ever really consciously linked worthiness. If it was something about spirituality, then definitely I would wonder if like Tim had more access to the spirit. Could he be getting inspiration that I don't have because he presides and I don't? But I think in regular days, it was more of just this understanding that I had that my role was to be low maintenance and to like keep the boat from rocking. That was my job in the house, because that's how I understood what help meet was. And I think some of our church history that we have to grapple with is polygamy. I think that the women way back, this is like 180 years ago now, but I think those women who are all part of my ancestry, they had to learn how to just sweep things under the rug, not rock the boat, because there wasn't bandwidth to have big emotions. And I think that was brokenness that I had to grapple with in our history, but also that I had to grapple with in our families, because I think that was a trait that was really passed down from mother to daughter to me.
Yeah.
This was something all of my sisters and I have, and mom, like this is something we've all had to really grow out of because it feels like it's just in our blood.
Yes, I'd be curious to hear both of your perspectives on how did this show up in parenting then after you had kids?
From my perspective, I would say that that's sort of the one domain where the opposite played out a little bit, because again, we were stepping into these sort of foreordained roles about like what a father is and what a mother is. Father presides and, is the breadwinner, presides and provides, or whatever people say. And the mother is sort of the quote unquote, I'm just doing air quotes for listeners all over the place here, primary caretaker of the children. And so I feel like that's maybe the one place, Aubrey, I'd be curious what you think here, where Aubrey sort of naturally stepped into the leading role and I was sort of playing second fiddle a little bit.
Totally agree. I think in a way that was sort of stepping stone to something that became a lot more healing. It was a place where I did feel like I was able to develop a little bit of a self because it was this carved out space that did feel like mine. So I think in a way there was still something unhealthy about it, but it was the beginning of a lot of healing.
That is so fascinating because for me, that was completely the opposite. That
Really?
stepping
Oh, really?
into the role of being a mother and a caretaker was what kind of brought this to a head. That I was
Wow.
just completely self-sacrificing myself and anything I could want. I never even thought about my own dreams or careers or things because it was always kind of linked to this, well, I have to be a stay-at-home mom. And so when I'm
Yeah.
thinking about what I'm going to do, what would be a good career for a stay-at-home mom?
Yeah.
Or what would be. And so then having a kid and being at home and seeing all these moms around me who seemed so happy, and in our church having lots of rhetoric of having kids will be the best thing and like the most joyous thing a woman can do is to be a mother. And I'm like, this is awful and I'm miserable and I'm trying to do what I felt like this role of mine was to be a stay-at-home mom, but I was completely miserable. And I think a lot of that had been just because I'd never allowed myself to have desires or passions because it was just like, well, this is what my future life is supposed to fit in. And so I'd never explored that. So that's so fascinating that motherhood was an area that you felt like you could express some of your
like have some authority.
self. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Could I ask, I'm curious, Aubrey made a comment just before this. Ariel, you're going to have to send us a bill after this because it's basically a
therapy
session, I think.
Perfect.
For us.
I love it.
Yeah. But Aubrey, you said that you thought that your role was to be low maintenance. We haven't really talked too much about this, but I feel like at times you've been sort of protecting me from difficulty. And I haven't actually seen this too much. I think it's more this like previous life. But I remember times when I would like come home and you'd be like, okay, this thing happened, but I took care of it in this way. Don't worry about it. Or I would find out days after or weeks after that something had happened, that it happened, but like it was all taken care of. And I started, I think in some ways to actually feel like a little bit annoyed might be too strong of a word, but just like I wanted to be recognized as somebody that could handle difficulty. I wanted us to actually be going through stuff together, but I felt like you felt like it was your job to like completely smooth whatever road I was on so that I didn't have to deal with anything. And sometimes to the extent I wouldn't even hear about it.
Oh, totally. I was thinking before the interview actually started, the image that kept coming to mind, I was thinking about your first question about like what patterns did you bring, and the image that kept coming to mind is like a snow plow. That is what I thought I was supposed to be, ahead of the cars, just like clearing the way and making sure that whatever comes up is handled. And that's exhausting and it's really disconnecting because you're not doing hard things together.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy though, because the snowplow doesn't have a destination. It's just like only in service of everybody else.
That's so true. Oh, yeah.
That's a really good analogy. So was that hard for you to start not taking those things on, Aubrey, and letting Tim have hardship or things he had to face?
I'm trying to think of another good analogy because in some ways it is hard, but also an instant relief. What's the thing that you always like feel nervous about and then like you love it? I still have that gut reaction to handle things and then not talk about it. Like I want to not ever have to be the bearer of bad news. But at the same time, it was the first time I just said, like, this is the big problem that I'm super stressed about. Like, there was like so much connection. You feel this power in teamwork that I just really hadn't experienced unless it was so big. I had to tell him. And so in a lot of ways, like those little things that come up are gifts. I love figuring it out together because it's not draining. It's cool to be able to problem solve. The feeling afterward, after like figuring out something dumb, but that was stressful, is just, and actually, in a lot of ways, hosting the podcast has been therapy because we get to experience that over and over. Like preparing for an interview and reading the book and writing interview questions and setting them all up. It's a lot of just kind of like a roller coaster of stress. And then when the interview is done or the podcast episode is out, there is this really intense feeling of connection that we have with each other. And I think it's just because we're doing some stressful things together. And I was really like denying our marriage those experiences by trying to troubleshoot by myself.
In Aubrey's defense, a little bit, I am a worrier. Like I tend to be a fairly high anxiety person. And so I don't think I was necessarily easiest person to deliver bad news to. To be clear, it's not my thing to like explode or get mad or whatever, but I can see how, given that I sort of like to have high baseline anxiety level, that Aubrey wouldn't want to add to that.
But maybe we can go here next. Most transformative thing I think that we have worked on is letting each other own our own feelings. And I think for years, I just only felt Tim's feelings. And they weren't his real feelings, but they were the feelings that I thought he was having.
You thought
like,
he was having.
That's all I had access to. Yeah, how he was feeling. And it's just such a relief to be like, you know what? That's his. Of course, usually when there's a new stressful situation, I'm genuinely unrealistically optimistic. And Tim is usually catastrophizing a little bit. We used to kind of be in this, and not an argument, but this pull for trying to convince each other that we should be unrealistically optimistic or unrealistically pessimistic. And it's just kind of a relief to be like, this is just how we do stress. Tim's going to feel like it's the end of the world for a little while, and I'm going to be delusional for a little while. And we're both going to just work through it and settle down, and we'll solve the actual problem together. And once we stopped trying to fix each other's feelings, it just got so much easier. And I just feel like now when things come up, it just doesn't feel like it causes tension between us. And that used to always be the case. Like whatever the problem, I felt like the real problem was that I'm going to feel a lot of tension between us. Mm-hmm. And now it really feels like, even though we have totally different go-to reactions, that we can feel connected from the beginning.
What you're saying just makes me keep thinking of the word peacemaker, because growing up and just in my marriage, my view of that word was the way to make peace is to not contribute or not have an opinion and just kind of hold it in. And that peace comes from that. And I feel like we need a better definition of a peacemaker.
That's such a good point.
Because peace, like you were saying, it wasn't peaceful. It was this haze of heaviness for days or however you were struggling through. But I think a lot of, especially women, Tim, tell me if you feel this, but I think a lot of women especially are like, the way to be a peacemaker is just not to contribute my opinion and just let things go as they are.
I think you're totally pinpointing the problem. And the reason that it's so hard to even recognize what's going on, because we have this beautiful language around something that's really broken. And I don't think that's what that language is. I think peacemaking looks like getting your hands dirty and like getting in the middle of it and finding a solution. But I totally agree that the way we talk about it is that we're just going to bow out and
let them have our toys or let them date whatever.
Yes. And smile.
Yes. Be happy about it.
Yeah.
Which I completely felt what I was talking about with my role. It was like, I just need to put on this face that I am enjoying this, even though, and I equated motherhood as well, which part of the problem was with having a perfectly clean home and making good dinners and just all these things that didn't come naturally to me or that I really thrived in, like even as a kid, which I know this might not be the case for probably most women, but I've never really liked babies. And so then to come into this role that I'm expected to like love kids and love spending all my time with them. And I'm like, that's really not me. I do love my kids and I'm so grateful for that. Because when I was pregnant with our first, I was like, Kyle, I don't like babies. What if I don't like our baby? What am I going to do? And then just putting the feelings on him that this is my role. So anytime I would ask him for help with it, it felt like he didn't have to say yes, or if he was in the middle of something, I just had to shoulder it because motherhood or parenting in quotes
yes.
fine.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of guilt for me.
That resonates a lot. Yeah.
I think that's probably a pretty common dynamic. I mean, it has been for us too, where I think Aubrey takes so much responsibility on that side of things that like if she's going to be gone, kids are at home or whatever, like she feels like she needs to like manage my schedule so that I'm home instead of me. And it's been totally me that's just sort of like bought into that dynamic too, where it's like the thing you hear where a dad says, "Oh, I've got to babysit my kids tonight," or whatever.
Right?
Like
you're not
babysitting. You're not babysitting, right?
babysitting.
So I think, yeah, that can be very common. It's one that we've fallen into, I think,
Well,
too.
it's always a dance. There's always a dance. Tim's going to feel like he's babysitting if I set out dinner and make a list and like treat him like a babysitter,
Yeah.
And the great thing about all of this stuff is it just feels like more than half the battle is just recognizing the issue. And then as soon as you're able to articulate it together, so much of the problem is fixed because like the babysitting thing, you just don't do that next time. And then suddenly you realize he never needed it in the first place. Everybody's fine and he's fine. And the problem was that we were both just doing this dance. And as soon as one person stops, then you're okay.
I think when Aubrey started making that transition, it wasn't necessarily super smooth sailing for me either to like not have the dinner taken care of or whatever. But like, I think appreciate being trusted. I feel a lot more connection when there's an implicit message by Aubrey not smoothing the way for me that she trusts me. And I also appreciate the opportunity for growth and learning by having to deal with stuff that I didn't have to deal with before. To me, it's only positive when you start acting truly as equals.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I found that I remember I was studying for a test or something in my program last year. And I took longer, like always. Kyle and I are both really bad at that. Yeah, I'll be home in 15 minutes. And it's like an hour, right? And I got home and he was like, I am so done with the kids. And in my head, I was like, yes, I feel this so often. But it was just this moment of he could appreciate me more because he'd been given the chance to take some of that responsibility that I often carried because he's working. And I think that has been a tricky one for us, especially with me in school, is like his labor is paid and mine is not paid. And just naturally in the back of our heads, we often prioritize his over mine because of the payment, because that's what's bringing in income. And so just talking about that and trying to figure out mine is important still, but it's hard because I have to find a babysitter so that I can work on homework or, do things during the day. And so I'd love to hear your guys' perspectives. You were talking, Aubrey, that once one person kind of stopped that dance, it couldn't happen. What are some more insights into kind of changing that dynamic? Because it doesn't happen overnight and it can be a really hard shift, especially like I let him do it and then he didn't get the kids to bed till 10 and now I'm going to pay for it tomorrow,
Yeah, that's funny. Maybe this is backing up even a little bit, but I feel like the thing that has been most useful for me is developing a healthy sense of self. I think until you do that, it's sort of tricky to ask for something big. You have to have some kind of connection with what you really want. Like, what is your goal? And so I think before we were even capable of switching up the dynamic in our relationship, I think I really had to do a lot of work with just developing a self and recognizing that I can still choose to sacrifice, but what I was doing wasn't giving or sacrificing from a healthy self. It was just, there was nothing to give. It wasn't a charitable thing to do. It was the only thing I could do because I was see-through, like I was just like an attachment to Tim, like whatever he needed, that's what I was giving. It wasn't like this solid, full place where I could choose to be loving by making something easier for him. And so I think it took some years of really getting back in touch with who I really am. And that started in the smallest ways. Like I remember how hard it was. We'd be out on the weekends looking for somewhere to go to dinner. And I genuinely, like, nothing sounds good or bad. I just feel totally numb. And it became like a spiritual practice to choose something. For a long time, Tim would, because it was frustrating and exhausting. I just hated it. I hated having to make a decision. And so sometimes it would help if like Tim would narrow down, these 3 things sound really good to me. And then I could pick one, or the other way around. Like, these three things sound really good to me. And then Tim can pick the other. And slowly that just got easier and easier. And then, like, pretty soon I really did know what I wanted. Things started sounding really good or just not good. Or like sometimes all I could get in touch with, this one thing sounds bad. And then it just feels like you kind of build on that and it grows. And I started a little after all of this work started, I started doing cake decorating and wedding cakes and started this little business. And that was really therapeutic for me too, because it was sort of like my own domain where I was just doing it on my own, 100% by myself. I would like stay up all through the night and make these wedding cakes alone, make creative decisions alone. I had to decide what looked good and what looked bad and what tasted good and tasted bad. And I was managing my own pricing and pickup time and buying the ingredients that I preferred and having to make hundreds of decisions about cake with like made it a little bit easier. And all of that just felt like practice. And I started noticing like when I really felt like I couldn't access a real preference, it helped to even just say, okay, like I don't know what I want, but if I knew what I want, it might be this. Make a guess. And that felt like low pressure, but it was a way to kind of trick my brain into having some sort of preference. And I also read this book called Care of the Soul by Thomas More. And he talks about developing yourself, but with the intention of being able to connect to God. He sort of took it to the next level and just said, your soul and your having a healthy self is the way that you can connect with the divine. He calls it recognizing what your soul presents. That's how you get in touch with the thing that God created. You have these preferences that arise out of nothing. What if you just believe that was so beautiful because that's part of your soul? And that was a way that made me feel like this wasn't selfish. This was digging for something that was so true about me that it would put me in touch with God, because it was a preference and a desire that I just came with. And that's the closest thing I have to accessing the divine. And so once all that dirty pain about this is selfish could be pushed aside, then it just felt like spiritual work that had this noble purpose. And it felt like that gave me so much more momentum. And then you can start to see all of the good fruit so quickly. I could see immediately that this was causing so much more intimacy in our relationship as opposed to disconnection that I expected from selfishness.
That was brilliant. I'm not sure I have too much to add. I would say that Aubrey's example that she brought up of the cake business where she was decorating, baking cakes, it was really helpful for me too, because that was maybe the first time that I stepped into sort of a support role outside of just parenting, where like sometimes I had to like play chauffeur. Like she'd be delivering a cake to Park City, and on all those hills, she has to like be balancing the cake. Literally, this is a thing if you're in the cake business, is cakes tipping over in cars on the way to venues. It'd be like my job to just sort of chauffeur her there and drive the car really smoothly. That's just in support of what she wants to do. I felt like that was really connecting too, because for so long, in a really great way, but also in an unequal way, like she had been playing that role for me. Like we uprooted the family and moved to Boston because it was sort of assumed that we would go wherever my career was taking me. I felt like that was increased trust and connection and a way for me to show her that I did love her in an equal way and wanted to support her. And the other aspect about cakes, I'm going to put forth the hypothesis here, and it might be
I
terrible.
cannot wait.
It's that when Aubrey started doing this, she got into a cadence where she was making 3 or more cakes per week, every single week. These are like multi-tier wedding cakes. Sometimes they'd be for graduations or birthdays, but they were always extremely elaborate. And she's incredibly talented.
They're beautiful.
They're amazing.
Oh, thank you.
The time commitment to make 3 or more cakes a week is actually crazy. On most of these, she would be staying up 3/4 of the night or more in order to get it done. And I'd be curious to hear more about Aubrey's perspective on this sort of transitional period, because it was not like, oh, start the cake business, oh, go to a therapy session and the self is now here, you know? The hypothesis is that there can be some merit to overdoing it for a while. Like the pendulum has swung so far to one side, you can't just swing it back to the middle right away necessarily. You've got to really get some muscle that and get it all the way to the other side in order to experience that and then find some balance. And I think the corollary is like on our podcast, we talk about faith crisis and faith deconstruction sometimes. And you see this too. The more damaging a view a person has of God, the more they have to deconstruct God in order to find a place where they're feeling harmony in their faith. The less damaging their view of God, if they truly have seen God as this sort of like unconditionally loving being that always sees you as worthy and having worth and just there to support you, then there's not really too much to deconstruct. Like that's kind of where you want to land anyway, potentially. But if God is this judgmental, angry, vindictive character, for a lot of people, it's got to go, pendulum's got to go all the way to the other side. There is no God. I'm an atheist. It's over for me, in order to, and I'm not trying to say that anybody's journey needs to take any particular form. I'm just saying that this is what we've seen a lot in the particular realm that we're in. They've got to go there before they come back to a very different view of God that works for them. And so in this particular case, I feel like Aubrey had to do that for a while too. And like, from my perspective, that was a little bit hard. And I'm not asking anyone to shed any tears whatsoever. In some ways it was like, oh, she's gone. Like, she's doing cakes again. Like, I'm going to bed alone again. But like, I think it's a necessary step.
I think that's so true, Tim. We've never talked about that. I think that's spot on. But I think the other thing that was really important in this whole process was learning to disappoint people, because at the end of the day, I think that was maybe the actual fear. Like, the reason I'm being a snowplow, or I'm protecting everybody from, but especially Tim, from any sort of negative feelings. And the reason I'm self-silencing, it was all about just not wanting to disappoint people. And so I needed a way to just practice doing that. And at the beginning of this cake business, I was seriously undercharging, because it kind of like what you were saying, Ariel, with your husband. It was a way to control their reaction. If I was really undercharging, then they had to be happy with the price and they had to be happy with the product because they were getting such a good deal. It was unreasonable to feel anything but complete gratitude. It was kind of this way to workshop that feeling of disappointing people. And then over the years, slowly getting more comfortable with telling people something's going to cost more than they want to pay, or telling Tim, I'm going to stay up all night. Sorry. It's like these little opportunities to practice disappointing someone and realizing that it's okay. We still have a relationship. There's something after disappointing someone. And I think for so long, I couldn't even imagine what it looked like, because there was so much energy and fear around not letting that happen. And it was just a relief to be like, you know what? They'll find a different baker. Everybody's going to be okay. We're both going to wake up at the same time tomorrow and we're going to feel fine. There's something after disappointment, and it's not actually my job to protect people from that disappointment. And that just felt like so much freedom. Doing that over and over enough to really believe that it wasn't something that I had to have on my mind every day, all day, was just, that was the gift.
And I really related with that. I feel like for me, fulfilling that role was more about not disappointing God than other people. And then when I finally started talking with Kyle about this and things I had expected him to think, he's like, why don't you let me decide what I think and I'll tell you, instead of you just thinking that this is what I want you to do. Exactly. And as I've started my podcast and going back to school, it's been a really beautiful journey, because he has an opportunity to support me, which was kind of what you were saying, Tim. Was like, before it was like, I move here because of your job, and I watch the kids later and do bedtime by myself because you're whatever. And just having the opportunity to be doing something that I love and am passionate about and have him support me has been a really beautiful part, I think, of this journey of becoming more equals in our relationship. Tim, did you find that certain beliefs had to shift for you, or did you have to change certain behaviors to allow room for Aubrey to be more of an equal partner?
I don't know if it was behavior so much, but this all coincided for us with a shift in our faith. And like I said, the ease with which I sort of fell into this trap, I think, was built on a foundation of sort of scriptural literalism and to some extent a light fundamentalism. You can't take everything Paul says in the Bible super seriously. Some things are really great, but like, if you're going to live a partnership of equals, if I'm being honest, you have to call that into question. Even those of us that are millennial age and up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, like certain rituals, certain quotes from church leaders, you have to soften that and understand that there's a lot of context going into place and time when people were saying these things, because a lot of it is explicitly patriarchal. So yes, for me, like, this faith shift, in many ways, stepping into my own authority as a person, like, it's different for me as a man, but like, I definitely had a very hierarchical view of the world, where it's like, whoever my church leader is, their authority supersedes mine, and whoever their leader is, their authority supersedes theirs. And as a young, immature person, I didn't realize that at the end of the day, my own authority could be my greatest authority. I had to sort of get there in order to take certain of those scriptures or certain of those quotes or certain of those rituals and throw them out a little bit in the service of living out my belief that we truly are equal.
For both of you, what has been some of the biggest challenges in working toward becoming equal partners? And what have you done to work through those? For you, Aubrey, you were talking a little bit about practicing sharing, but I want to hear just a couple more things about what that's been like.
It's so much harder to do it the other way. It's so much harder to do it with inequality and without a self. Yeah, it's been a lot of intentional practice, but overall, that just doesn't compare to those cycles of resentment and conflict and fear. And like, it's such a different kind of hard that it's hard to even call it that, because it just feels like really soul-filling growth.
Freeing almost.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
For me, it's just, I think, patience. The only thing I'm worried about in this conversation is somebody walking away with the impression that this happened overnight. This is like probably going on a decade.
Well, going on. Yeah. It's not like it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's still
Like,
going on.
It hasn't finished.
We had sort of a funny one last week, I think, where I expressed some doubt about a big life decision that we were potentially making. And Aubrey, realizing that I had that doubt, oh, if that's like stressing you out, shut it down. Don't worry about it. Even though I think she did not want to shut it down. Am I saying that right, Aubrey?
Yes.
But it was nice because that wasn't a moment of conflict so much. And I think we both sort of intuitively recognized that we were stepping into old patterns a little bit. And then we talked about it again, I think 4 or 5 days later. We both had perspective of what was going on and not even come to a resolution, just be totally open about what's going on with our feelings and what we're thinking. And so like, this is not by any means resolved. The principle that I'm getting at is just patience. Like, don't beat yourself up when there are moments of difficulty. I mean, to anyone in a partnership, like whichever side you find yourself on, like, I assume that we'll be able to, if we came back on your podcast, Ariel, in another 10 years.
I was like, we'll have to do a 10-year
right.
reunion.
I assume like, hopefully we'd be saying very different things then than we're saying now, because we've sort of like stayed in the struggle and kept learning.
Yeah. And these traditions are hard to break.
I was just going to add, Ariel, like, I don't know if this is a God thing or I don't know how to explain it, but I really feel like looking back, it's been so interesting to see how it does kind of feel like you get fed line upon line. Like, that's the phrase, right? It just feels like you become aware of something. Maybe it's a problem, or maybe it's like a book that you just feel your energy flowing to, like you're just excited about it and you're interested in the subject. And so you tackle that one thing, and then it just feels like there's another thing that just flows to you. And it just feels like, I really believe that we're meant to grow in this life. We're meant to become more whole and complete. And I think for a lot of women, especially in our faith tradition, this is, and for men too, on the other side of the spectrum, this is part of the growth that we're supposed to have in this life. And it feels like as soon as it's on your radar, then these opportunities and these lessons just start flowing to you. And I just feel like we've been led along, like all this decade or these 17 years, we've been led along little by little to just learn the next thing. And I think the lesson that we're learning now, we weren't in a position to understand or be ready for when we had been married for 2 years. But it feels like there's this transcendent thing that happens when you have this intention to grow and heal. And it feels like God really helps you along and gives you those opportunities and resources to get on that path of just learning line by line.
I love that. And just what you were saying too, that it's not as hard as the self-silencing and self-sacrificing, which seems almost opposite, but there's such beautiful depth of connection and vulnerability that it makes up for the hardness.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. It's like a workout. Like it's hard to exercise, but like it feels so good. Like it's different than the hard of like being sick or injured, or the hard that is hard on your soul, and so it feels like you have the energy to keep trying, even though it is difficult, but the kind of difficult that is actually really energizing.
Yeah. And you talked about how you had limited your relationships. So briefly, what are some of the blessings that you guys have both found through this journey of Aubrey kind of coming into herself more?
Well, I can just say, I feel like we have a deeper friendship that even though we've always been in love, I think that I had really big walls around my most real insecurities and vulnerabilities. And so I think that sort of blocks you from actual intimacy, and being able to create new patterns where I can just share that always with Tim makes us capable of a kind of deep friendship that I just think we weren't even capable of. And we didn't know we were missing, but that's been such a source of joy. for us in these last few years.
I totally agree with that. I think that's the first thing that came to mind for me too, is just that increased connection. Like somebody in a partnership is silencing themselves, I think that it's sort of like a wall that's blocking off a whole part of the relationship that needs to be explored, and we were not fulfilling our potential as partners and in seeing all aspects of a relationship as long as we sort of blocked that off from ourselves. And so that has led to this deep friendship and connection that's been really meaningful. And like I mentioned before, I also feel so much more trusted when Aubrey trusts me enough to disagree with me, or trust me enough to like throw something at me that's difficult. That builds up my own soul. Maybe the biggest thing, well, arguably a big thing, has been, I think, as we've sort of each found our place in the world, our unique place in the world, we've been able to collaborate more effectively and create beautiful things in the world together. Like, I'm actually very proud of the work that we've done on the Faith Matters podcast. And that's something that we've done 100% together, and I think has only been possible because of what we both uniquely bring to it. And if this had been 14 years ago and our partnership this is the Tim show and Aubrey's just in the supportive role, like, it would be totally different and so much worse, just like worse in every way. I really think we each bring our own thing to it. And that's not to say that we're great podcasters or whatever, but like in terms of,
They are.
That's very kind. But just in terms of like fulfillment of having done something creative and that we believe is worthwhile in the world, there's no way, if one of us had been sort of like stifling ourselves or seeing ourselves just as a helper, that it would have been possible.
This is all so beautiful. And what I have found in my relationship as well, just allowing Kyle to see me completely has changed our relationship and gone so much deeper. And there's so much more trust and connection. And you can build more things, like you were saying, Tim, just like bringing two complete full individuals into a partnership creates so much more than when there's one and a
right.
or a quarter. And we could probably spend a whole episode on this next question, but I would just love to hear a couple of thoughts, since we talk a lot about sexuality on here. How has this transition changed your sexual relationship? Because bringing a whole self, especially as a woman, someone who can say what you want or speak up for yourself, is completely different in a sexual relationship as well.
Yes. I mean, it's so interesting because I hadn't actually even really thought about it until I saw your question about that. And it's just so interesting that the benefits are the same in every single context. There's more intimacy when there's more honesty, and like being able to be known emotionally, I think just gives you access to a kind of intimacy that I didn't even know we were missing out on. And so I felt like this capacity for joy and creativity and fun, just everything gets easier and more fulfilling when you feel safe. And I think there was so much fear that it was safety that was lacking, and it was fear that was unexpressed. And so I think there was intimacy that could be had and wasn't because of all of that effort to protect vulnerability. And I think getting in the habit outside of the bedroom of just being vulnerable and open and letting yourself be known, like you were saying, is beneficial in every single context. And we've totally found that to be true inside the bedroom too. It feels like a gift that it was just like a side thing that I feel couldn't see coming, but has been such a sweet benefit to doing all of this work over the years,
Yeah.
I would echo that. The word that I keep coming back to is connection, and how much more deep connection you can have when two people are approaching a partnership in this way. Like early on, I think there was at times sort of an unspoken implication that a lot of our sexual relationship was for my sake. And the difference now, knowing that Aubrey has inhabited her whole self, and it gives me a feeling that whatever she's doing in any given moment, she's truly choosing. And that choice, to me, it makes me feel trusted and connected to her. Like that's like the sexual relationship. If I feel like that's something she truly wants and is expressing what she wants, then that fills me up and makes me feel so much more connected to her. So just like Aubrey said, it's every aspect of your life that this affects.
So good. I'm like, that might be another story for we don't need all the details, but we might have to have another episode. Thanks for hanging with me for a longer episode. You guys had so many good insights. As we're closing up, could you just share several actionable tips for couples who are maybe wanting to start this process and become equal partners? What would you say for them to get started?
I would just say, so one of the exercises that my favorite book, this Care of the Soul book, suggests that was really helpful for me is that he said you should just get a piece of paper and just free write everything that your soul presents, like what comes up for you that just feels like a deep preference. And I think it helps kind of think back when you were young, like what things did you love? And I would do that as just part of, I love journaling, and I would just do that as I journaled. I would notice something like, I've always loved frogs. I just do. And it's super weird. And I've loved like catching frogs, and I love frog pictures. And like, that was one of the very first things that went on my list. I guess my soul is presenting frogs. I don't know. But like practicing in a really low pressure way when no one's asking for it, it was really useful for me to kind of like get in touch with like, what is like unique and totally me. That felt like maybe the first real baby step. And then the next thing I would say is always trying to make a decision, even when it doesn't matter. Deciding if you're going to use placemats or not, which fast food you prefer on a road trip, things that don't matter. And it doesn't mean everyone has to comply and you do that thing, but it feels like important work to just access the thing that is you slightly prefer over another. And I feel like those two things gave me traction to do the harder, more problematic things. And they're kind of fun. Like it gave me a lot of energy too and momentum.
Thanks for going first, Aubrey. You keep letting me like jot down my thoughts so while you're talking. So I actually have something to say. The first one for me is just keep the conversation going. I think the only way that you can be sure that you're not moving forward is if you're not talking about this. And so as difficult as it is, keep talking. And obviously, sort of blanket statement, I think obviously that should always be done in kindness. Another thing that we've done that has actually been really helpful to us, and this is a little bit of a cliche, is we are religious about at least a weekly date. And it can be so difficult with kids, especially little kids. And there's financial sacrifices for babysitters and everything else. But probably like in a given week, 90% plus of our like deepest conversations happen on that date, just because it's like time out for us. And almost never do we go out to dinner and it's just the two of us where we don't have a conversation that really moves the needle in some way. And then maybe unique to us, or maybe it's more broadly applicable, but like, again, finding something creative to do together has been really, really meaningful, helped us like learn more about each other and deepened our connection. And last thing for both of us that I maybe is the biggest one has been going to professional therapy. Aubrey mentioned her experience and how meaningful that was. And for me to play my part in this, I needed to get in control of my OCD, because that was definitely a big inhibitor to me, like having the shift in mindset that I needed. It was just a difficult thing that was sort of always overhanging our relationship anyway, and exacerbated my anxiety dramatically in any given context. I don't think you can discount the importance of having a professional to talk through these things with.
That's so true. I've had help with that as well, starting to, okay, what do I like? What am I going to do if I'm by myself?
Right.
It's so scary. And I love those thoughts of starting small, because it takes a lot of vulnerability and risk, because there is a risk of your partner maybe not listening when you share. But that risk, I think, is why it's so beautiful when
Totally.
we can be intimate and vulnerable. Thank you both so much. So where can people find you? I'll link the Faith Matters podcast. Is there anywhere else you would have people look?
That's it.
Well, Aubrey, shouldn't we give your Instagram cakes?
Oh,
yes. And the Instagram handle for cakes.
Luna Cakes Co.
LUNA Cakes Co.
Thank you.
I'll link that as well.
You're going to find out that as hard as we sold this, we were actually underselling it. It's even better than you have imagined.
It is amazing.
Thank you.
Our
That's
cakes
so
are
nice.
amazing. Thank you both so much. This has been awesome.
Thank you, Ariel. That was so fun.
Thanks, Ariel.
I don't know how you feel at the end of that episode, but for me, there were just so many things that I was thinking about and have helped me already. We had some of those old patterns show up in our relationship that have been happening. And this episode gave me the courage to bring them up and to talk about them. And so my husband and I were able to make more of a plan about how we're going to work on being more equal partners and better supporting my goals. And listening to Aubrey, I feel like I can totally relate to the snowplow analogy, just trying to be the individual in our relationship who makes it so that my kids and my husband don't have as much resistance when they're going forward with things. And I loved thinking about making sure that Kyle gets to be a part of those hard decisions instead of just trying to figure it out so he doesn't have to worry about it. It can actually strengthen our relationship. And it can be so great when there are things stressing me out and burdens I'm carrying to share that instead of trying to take it on all by myself. And I know that this can be a really hard process, speaking from experience, because it's something I have struggled with so much. I have struggled in being the one in the relationship who silences myself because I want to preserve the relationship. I want it to be so good that I silence myself to just go along with what Kyle wanted and to be this supporting role. And as I've learned to speak up and to be more of a self and bring that authentic self, our relationship has blossomed. He wanted me to be a part, but I was silencing myself, trying to create this authentic relationship with a lot of depth. And in doing that, I actually hindered our ability to have a deep and authentic relationship. And on the other side, it's taken a lot of humility for him, even in our conversation that this episode brought up, to listen to the hard feelings that I've been having and that I've been silencing, and then to make a plan together. What are we going to do about it? And that can go the other way as well when he brings up hard things that he's feeling, and for me to be able to humbly listen. I also found it really insightful when Tim was talking about Aubrey starting her cake business and how the pendulum seemed to swing pretty far, that she was staying up like all night long working on these cakes. And then he got to be in this supporting role. And I love that. I think especially for me, after silencing myself for so long, it was a really beautiful shift for Kyle to support me. And it allowed me as well to see him jump into this role that I had been taking for a long time. And some of the things, I think I mentioned it in this episode, but just being able to see him get frustrated with the kids and to realize, oh, it's not actually that I'm not as patient as Kyle is. It's actually just that I'm with the kids 24/7, and whoever is with the kids 24/7 will probably get more easily frustrated with them. And I hope that after listening to this episode, you and your partner have a really good chat. I hope this brings up a lot of great conversations for you to figure out what patterns are happening in our relationship that may not really be serving both of us, and what can we do to shift those? How can we both support each other? And if one of you has been in the main supporting role, what are we going to do so that the other person has a chance to support? This is a process. This is something that is going to need to keep being practiced and growing into and becoming a better partnership as you grow in your relationship. Just like Tim and Aubrey talked about. Let's come back in 10 years, right? And see, hopefully we're still on this journey. And so I hope to challenge you to keep this conversation going. Keep it open. We've been working on this for years, and some of those patterns are still persisting, but we're intentionally trying to shift them to a better place. And that gives me so much hope. And if you haven't already, make sure and pause the episode right now, go to the show notes and press on my free download link, Find Yourself After Kids. I included 5 of the most important things that I did that helped me bring my full self to our relationship and really show up authentically. So make sure and get that free download so that you can start showing up more authentically. And if that's not incentive enough, I also have links to all of my favorite sex products, parenting products, and just some of my very favorite household goods. So you don't want to miss this free download. Stop right now, click on the link, and get that download right to your inbox. Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Kimberly Demers, and our miscellaneous task whiz, Jana Norman. As always, thanks for talking love.